No nanny lasted a week with the Millionaire'S twins, but she showed the photo of his lost brother, and he froze. The grandfather clock in the foyer chimed 10 o'clock, its deep resonance echoing through the Donovan mansion like a funeral bell. Michael Donovan straightened his tie for the third time, staring at his reflection in the hallway mirror. Dark circles shadowed his green eyes, and his once pristine appearance had given way to the worn look of a man fighting a losing battle on too many fronts. "Dad, you look like you're about to throw up," 6-year-old Caleb observed from the top of the marble staircase, his twin brother Jacob snickering beside him. "Language, Caleb," Michael called up half-heartedly, though throw up hardly qualified as inappropriate. After 17 failed attempts at hiring a nanny, his standards for propriety had plummeted faster than his company's stock price. The doorbell rang, and Michael's stomach actually did lurch. Grace Miller. He'd almost hung up when she'd called yesterday about the job posting. Her references were modest at best. Families from Savannah he'd never heard of. No prestigious agencies or wealthy connections. But something in her voice, a quiet determination mixed with genuine warmth, had made him reconsider. Besides, what choice did he have? The Donovan group was hemorrhaging money while he juggled single parenthood with the finesse of a circus clown. His board of directors was circling like vultures, and his assistant had started screening calls from creditors. Michael opened the heavy oak door to find a woman about his age standing on the front steps, her light brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore a modest navy dress and carried a worn leather purse, but it was her eyes that caught him off guard. Deep brown, and filled with a sadness he recognized all too well. "Mr. Donovan, I'm Grace Miller." Her handshake was firm, her smile genuine but cautious. Up close, he noticed the way she held herself, like someone who'd learned early not to expect too much from life, but refused to give up hope entirely. "Thank you for coming, Miss Miller. Please come in." As they walked through the foyer, Michael caught her taking in the surroundings, the crystal chandelier Anna had insisted on, the family portraits lining the walls, the fresh scratches on the antique side table, courtesy of last week's pirate ship adventure. If Grace was intimidated by the grandeur or put off by the obvious signs of chaos, she didn't show it. "Beautiful home," she said simply. "It was," Michael replied before he could stop himself. He cleared his throat. "I mean, it still is. It's been challenging lately." They settled in his study, Michael behind the massive mahogany desk that had belonged to his grandfather, Grace in one of the leather chairs across from him. The morning light streaming through the tall windows illuminated dust motes dancing in the air. Another reminder of how everything had fallen apart since Anna died. "I have to be honest with you, Ms. Miller," Michael began, pulling out a file folder. "This position, it's not for everyone, my sons. Caleb and Jacob, they're going through a difficult time." Grace nodded, her hands folded in her lap. "You mentioned in our phone conversation that they lost their mother. I can't imagine how hard that must be for all of you." There it was again, that quality in her voice that seemed to understand pain without being consumed by it. Michael found himself studying her face, searching for signs of the judgment he'd grown accustomed to seeing in potential caregivers' eyes. 3 years ago, he said quietly. "Car accident. The boys were just 3 then, and he paused, gathering himself. "They haven't exactly made it easy for the people we've hired to help." 17, Grace said softly. Michael blinked. "Excuse me, 17 previous nannies. That's what your ad mentioned." She leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Donovan, I worked at St. Anne's Orphanage in Savannah for 5 years before taking private positions. I've seen children who've lost everything they've ever known, who lash out because it's the only way they know how to communicate their pain. Your sons aren't bad kids. They're hurt kids." Something tight in Michael's chest loosened a fraction. When was the last time someone had talked about his boys with understanding instead of exasperation? "The last nanny," he found himself saying, "ended up in the emergency room. Caleb convinced her to try out their new flying machine, which turned out to be a laundry basket attached to a rope at the top of the stairs. Before that, it was Jacob who somehow managed to put superglue in Mrs. Henderson's coffee. She couldn't open her mouth for 2 days. Instead of looking horrified, Grace's eyes sparked with something that might have been amusement. How creative. They're clearly intelligent children. That's one way to put it. Michael rubbed his temples. where a familiar headache was building. "Ms. Miller, I need you to understand what you'd be walking into. These aren't ordinary childhood pranks. They've turned this house into a war zone, and He stopped, not wanting to admit how completely overwhelmed he felt. "You're drowning," Grace said gently, and the simple acknowledgement of his situation nearly undid him. "The company needs me," Michael continued, his voice rougher than intended. "My father built the Donovan group from nothing, and now it's falling apart while I try to figure out how to be both mother and father to two boys who seem determined to drive away anyone who tries to help them." Grace was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving to the family photos on his desk. Professional portraits from happier times when Anna's laugh filled these rooms, and the boys' smiles were genuine instead of calculating. "Tell me about them," she said finally. "Not their pranks or their problems. Tell me about Caleb and Jacob." The request caught Michael off guard. Most interviews focused on schedules and disciplinary methods, not on who his children actually were. "Caleb's the planner," he heard himself saying. "He thinks everything through, sometimes too much. He used to spend hours building elaborate Lego cities, placing each piece just so. Jacob's more impulsive, all heart and no filter. He used to climb into our bed every morning and tell us his dreams. These wild, impossible stories that would make Anna laugh until she cried. Used to," Grace noted quietly. "Yeah, used to," Michael's voice caught. "Now Caleb barely speaks unless he's plotting the next way to torture our help. And Jacob screams, at night mostly. Nightmares about the accident, about losing people. The child psychologist says it's normal, part of the grieving process. But it's been 3 years, and I don't know how to fix it. Maybe," Grace said carefully, "they don't need to be fixed. Maybe they just need to be heard." Michael looked at her sharply. There was something in the way she'd said it, a certainty that seemed to come from personal experience rather than textbook knowledge. "Your references?" he said, changing the subject. "The families you worked for in Savannah. Why did you leave?" A shadow crossed Grace's face. "The children grew up, found their way. It was time to move on." It wasn't really an answer, but something told Michael not to push. Everyone had parts of their story they weren't ready to share. "Ms. Miller," he said finally, "I have to ask, why would you want this job? After everything I've told you, why would you consider taking on 2 traumatized 6-year-olds and their barely functioning father?" Grace was quiet for so long that Michael wondered if she'd changed her mind. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because sometimes the children who push the hardest are the ones who need love the most. And because," she hesitated, then met his eyes directly, "because I know what it feels like to lose everything when you're too young to understand why." In that moment, looking into Grace Miller's sad, determined eyes, Michael Donovan made a decision that would change all their lives forever, though he wouldn't understand just how completely until it was almost too late. "When can you start?" Grace Miller stood at the bottom of the grand staircase at 7:30 Monday morning, her simple canvas bag in one hand and a thermos of coffee in the other. The mansion felt different in the early morning light, less imposing, more like a home that had forgotten how to breathe properly. "Boys," Michael's voice echoed from somewhere upstairs, followed by the sound of running water and what might have been muffled cursing. "Grace is here." The response was immediate. A door slammed, followed by another. Then the unmistakable sound of small feet scurrying across hardwood floors. Grace took a sip of her coffee and waited. In her 5 years at St. Anne's, she'd learned that children's first moves revealed everything about their pain. Michael appeared at the top of the stairs, his hair damp and his expression frazzled. "I'm so sorry, they're being themselves. I can't find Jacob's left shoe, and Caleb claims he's suddenly developed a rare allergy to breakfast." "No worries," Grace called up, her voice carrying easily through the foyer. "We'll figure it out together." A small face peered around the banister. Caleb, studying her with calculating eyes that seemed far too old for 6. Behind him, Jacob hung back, clutching what looked like a stuffed elephant that had seen better days. Grace set down her bag and coffee, then sat on the bottom step, making herself smaller, less threatening. "Good morning, gentlemen. I'm Grace." Neither boy moved. Caleb's stare intensified, and Grace could practically see the wheels turning in his head. She'd bet money he was already planning her downfall. "I brought something for you," she said conversationally. Reaching into her bag, both boys leaned forward despite themselves. My friend Eleanor gave this to me when I was about your age. She pulled out a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth by countless hands. She said it was magic. Magic's not real, Caleb declared, but he took a step closer. Maybe not the kind in fairy tales, Grace agreed, but there's definitely magic in stories. Eleanor always said the best magic happens when someone takes time to really listen. Jacob crept down a few steps, dragging his elephant behind him. Up close, Grace could see the shadows under his eyes, the way he held himself like he expected the world to crash down at any moment. "What's in the box?" he whispered. Grace opened it carefully, revealing a collection of small objects. A smooth river stone, a pressed flower, a tiny brass key, a marble that caught the morning light. Memory keepers, each one has a story. "That's stupid," Caleb said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Want to hear about this one?" Grace picked up the stone, running her thumb over its surface. "When I was 5, I lived in a place where a lot of kids didn't have families. It was okay. We had people who took care of us. But sometimes at night, when it got really quiet, I'd feel so lonely it was hard to breathe." Both boys had gone completely still. Michael, who'd been watching from the top of the stairs, seemed frozen too. "One day I found this stone by a creek near our home. It was warm from the sun, smooth like it had been held by lots of people before me. When I held it tight, I didn't feel so alone anymore. Like maybe, somewhere, someone else had held this same stone when they were scared or sad, and somehow that connected us." Jacob sat down on the step beside her, close enough that Grace could smell the lingering scent of children's shampoo in his hair. "Did it work?" "Well," Grace said, "I still felt sad sometimes, but I didn't feel alone. There's a difference. Our mom died," Jacob said suddenly, his words barely audible. Grace nodded seriously. "I know. That must hurt terribly." "Everyone says she's in heaven," Caleb said, his voice sharp with anger. "They say she's watching over us and that she's happy now. But if she's so happy, why did she leave?" It was the kind of question that made adults squirm, the kind that usually got deflected with platitudes about God's plan or things happening for a reason. Grace had heard them all during her own childhood. "I don't know why she left," Grace said simply. "Sometimes terrible things happen and there's no good reason for them. When I lost my family, people said lots of things that were supposed to make me feel better. But mostly they just made me feel like I wasn't allowed to be angry about it." "You were angry?" Jacob asked, his eyes wide. "Furious," Grace admitted. "For a long time, I was angry at my parents for leaving, angry at the people who tried to replace them, angry at God, angry at myself for not being good enough to make them stay." "Did you do bad things?" Caleb asked. And there it was, the real question underneath all the misbehavior. "I broke things," Grace said. "I hid from people who tried to help me. I told lies and started fights and did everything I could think of to push away anyone who got too close, because if they left too, and they always seemed to leave, at least it would be because I made them, not because I wasn't worth staying for." The silence that followed was different from before. Not calculating or defensive, but thoughtful. Sister Margaret. She was like a mom to all of us kids. "She never left," Grace continued. "No matter what I did, how mean I was, how many times I tested her. One night, after I'd been particularly awful, she sat with me and said, 'Grace, honey, you're not pushing me away to protect yourself. You're pushing me away to protect me. You think you're so dangerous to love that anyone who tries will get hurt.'" "Were you?" Jacob whispered. "Dangerous to love?" Grace's throat tightened. "No, sweetheart, neither are you." Something shifted in Caleb's posture, a tiny crack in his armor. "The nannies always leave." "Yes, they do," Grace agreed. "And that's not because you're bad or unlovable. Sometimes people leave because the job is harder than they expected, or because they don't understand that when children are hurting, they don't always know how to ask for help the right way. Daddy cries sometimes," Jacob said quietly, shooting a guilty look up the stairs where Michael still stood. "At night, when he thinks we're sleeping." "But we're not supposed to know." Grace's heart clenched. She looked up at Michael, seeing the way he'd gone pale, the mortification in his eyes at being exposed by his 6-year-old. "Grown-ups cry too," she said gently. Your daddy lost someone very important to him. It makes sense that he'd be sad, but he has to take care of us, Caleb said, and Grace heard the weight of responsibility no child should carry. He can't be sad. Oh, honey. Grace shifted to face both boys fully. Your daddy can be sad about losing your mom and still love you more than anything in the world. Those feelings don't cancel each other out. Love isn't something that runs out when you use it on sadness, too. For the first time since she'd arrived, both boys really looked at her, not studying her for weaknesses or calculating her threat level, just looking, seeing her. Are you gonna leave too? Jacob asked, the question hanging in the morning air like a held breath. Grace could have given them false promises, empty reassurances that would have felt good in the moment. Instead, she chose honesty. I can't promise I'll never leave, she said. What I can promise is that if I ever do, it won't be because you weren't good enough or because you pushed too hard. It will be because sometimes life changes in ways we don't expect. And if that happens, we'll talk about it together first. Deal. Both boys nodded solemnly, as if they were signing a contract. Now, Grace said, standing and dusting off her hands, what do you say we find Jacob's missing shoe and convince Caleb that breakfast won't actually kill him? I make excellent pancakes, and I have it on good authority that they're completely allergy-friendly. Even if the allergy is made up, Caleb asked, a tiny smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Especially then, Grace said with mock seriousness. As they headed toward the kitchen, Jacob slipped his small hand into hers. At the top of the stairs, Michael Donovan wiped his eyes and wondered when he'd last heard his sons laugh, really laugh, at anything other than someone else's misfortune, for the first time in 3 years. The Donovan house felt like it might remember how to be a home. 2 weeks into Grace's employment, Michael found himself doing something he hadn't done in 3 years, arriving home with anticipation instead of dread. The change in his sons was nothing short of miraculous. Where once the mansion had echoed with screams and chaos, now he could hear actual laughter drifting from the kitchen as he climbed the front steps. Dad? Jacob's voice rang out as Michael opened the door. Grace taught us how to make snickerdoodles, and Caleb only burned 2 of them. They weren't burned, Caleb protested, appearing in the doorway with flour in his dark hair that was exactly the same shade as Michael's own. They were well done. Michael hung up his jacket, marveling at the normalcy of the scene. No furniture was overturned, no emergency calls from neighbors, no suspicious smells suggesting chemical experiments gone wrong. Just his boys, looking like actual children instead of tiny terrorists plotting world domination. How was school? He asked. A question that used to be answered with sullen silence or detailed reports of who had been tormented that day. Good. Jacob bounced on his toes. Mrs. Patterson said my handwriting is getting much better, and I didn't get sent to the principal's office at all this week. And Caleb, his older twin, shrugged. But there was no malice in it. It was fine. We're studying butterflies in science. Did you know some of them migrate thousands of miles? Before Michael could respond, Grace appeared from the kitchen, her sleeves rolled up and an apron tied around her waist. The sight of her there, so naturally domestic, sent an unexpected jolt through him. Perfect timing, she said, smiling. Dinner's almost ready, and the boys have been excellent sous chefs. We made your favorite, Jacob announced proudly. Michael frowned. My favorite. Chicken parmesan with garlic bread, Caleb said matter-of-factly. Grace said you probably hadn't been eating much real food lately. Just takeout and coffee. Michael's eyes found Grace's. A question in them. He'd never told her about his favorite meal. Hell, he'd barely remembered it himself until this moment. It had been Anna's specialty, something she'd made every Sunday during their first year of marriage. Lucky guess, Grace said lightly, but something flickered in her eyes. Most overworked single fathers survive on caffeine and whatever they can grab on the go. During dinner, their first real family meal in longer than Michael could remember, he found himself studying Grace more carefully. She cut Jacob's chicken into perfect bite-sized pieces without being asked, knew exactly how much salt Caleb liked on his food, and somehow managed to keep both boys engaged in actual conversation instead of their usual dinner table warfare. Grace, tell Dad about the song, Jacob said around a mouthful of garlic bread. What song? Michael asked. Grace's cheeks flushed slightly. It's nothing, really. Just something I used to sing at the orphanage. The boys had trouble sleeping last night. Thunderstorm. She knows Mom's lullaby. Caleb interrupted quietly. His fork paused halfway to his mouth. Michael went very still. What? The one about the mockingbird, Jacob said. The one Mom used to sing when we had bad dreams. Grace sang it exactly the same way. The room fell silent except for the gentle tick of the antique clock on the mantel. Michael stared at Grace, who had gone pale, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. It's a common lullaby, she said carefully. Most children know some version of it. But Michael knew it wasn't just any version. Anna had sung it with a specific melody, a variation she'd learned from her own grandmother. He'd never heard anyone else sing it quite the same way. Sing it again, he said softly. Michael, please. Grace looked between the boys, who were watching her with eager faces, then back at Michael. After a moment, she began to sing, her voice soft and sweet. Hush, little baby. Don't say a word. Mama's gonna buy you a mockingbird, and if that mockingbird won't sing, Mama's gonna buy you a diamond ring. But it was the way she sang it. The slight pause before diamond ring, the way her voice lifted on sing, that made Michael's breath catch. It was exactly, precisely, how Anna had sung it. When she finished, Jacob clapped his hands. See? Just like Mom. How? Michael's voice was barely above a whisper. Grace's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. I don't know. Maybe I heard it somewhere. Or... She trailed off, looking genuinely confused and a little frightened by his intensity. Grace, Caleb said suddenly, do you know the story about the brave little elephant? Now Grace looked completely bewildered. No, I don't think so. Mom made it up, Jacob explained. About an elephant who got lost from his family but never stopped looking for them because he knew they were looking for him too. She told it to us when we were scared, Caleb added. When we thought maybe she and Dad might disappear like some of the other kids' parents did. Michael remembered. Anna had created that story during their divorce proceedings when the boys had started having anxiety about their parents separating like so many of their friends had. She'd spent hours crafting the perfect tale about love that transcended distance and time. I'm sorry, Grace said quietly. I wish I knew that one. But as she spoke, Michael noticed her hand move unconsciously to her temple, rubbing small circles like she was trying to ease a headache, or access a memory that wouldn't quite surface. After dinner, while Grace helped the boys with homework in the living room, Michael found himself drawn to the kitchen window that overlooked the back garden. The sight that greeted him there made his chest tight with emotion. Grace sat cross-legged on the grass while Caleb and Jacob flanked her, all three of them looking up at the stars beginning to appear in the dusky sky. She was pointing out constellations, her voice carrying faintly through the glass. That's Orion, she was saying. See the 3 stars in a row. That's his belt. How do you know so much about stars? Jacob asked. When you don't have a family, Grace said simply, you learn to find friends in other places. The stars were always there, no matter where I was. You have a family now, Caleb said with 6-year-old certainty. You have us. Michael watched Grace pull both boys closer, her face soft with an emotion he couldn't quite name. But there was something else there too, a flicker of recognition, as if Caleb's words had touched something deep and familiar. Later, after the boys had been tucked into bed without their usual 15 minutes of negotiation and stalling tactics, Michael found Grace in the kitchen, washing the dinner dishes despite his protests that the housekeeper would handle them. You don't have to do that, he said, leaning against the counter. I don't mind. It's soothing. She glanced at him sideways. Your boys are wonderful, Michael, truly. They seem to think the same about you. He paused, then decided to voice what had been bothering him all evening. Grace, about the lullaby. Her hands stilled in the soapy water. What about it? Anna learned that version from her grandmother, who learned it from hers. It's not exactly common knowledge. Grace was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the dishes. Maybe I heard Anna sing it sometime. If she was anything like her sons, she probably had a lovely voice. It was possible. Michael supposed. Charleston wasn't that large a city, and Anna had sung in the church choir before the boys were born. Maybe Grace had attended a service, or heard it at some community event, but that didn't explain the star knowledge, or the way she'd known to cut Jacob's food just so, or how she'd instinctively understood that Caleb needed to feel useful in the kitchen rather than just watched. "Grace," he said carefully, "have we met before? Before you answered the ad, I mean?" She turned to face him fully, her brown eyes wide and honest. "I don't think so. I would have remembered." And Michael believed her. But as he watched her dry her hands on the dish towel, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something hovering just at the edge of his consciousness, some connection he was missing. "I should go," Grace said, hanging up the towel with the same precise fold Anna had always used. "Early day tomorrow." "Of course, Grace." She paused at the kitchen doorway. "Thank you for everything. I can't remember the last time this house felt so, like a home," she suggested gently. "Yeah, like a home." After she left, Michael climbed the stairs to check on the boys. He found them both sleeping peacefully. No nightmares, no midnight wanderings to his room, just the deep, restful sleep of children who felt safe. In Caleb's room, he noticed something new on the nightstand. A small wooden box, worn smooth by countless hands. Inside, barely visible in the dim light from the hallway, he could make out a collection of small objects. A stone, a pressed flower, a tiny brass key. Memory keepers, Grace had called them. As Michael turned off the light and headed to his own room, he found himself wondering what memories Grace Miller was keeping, and why the sight of that box filled him with a longing he couldn't quite name. Grace jolted awake at 3:17 a.m., her heart racing and her sheets damp with sweat. The dream had been so vivid she could still smell the magnolia blossoms and hear the distant sound of a fountain. A little boy with dark hair and green eyes had been calling her name. Not Grace, but something else. Something that felt like coming home even as it slipped away from her conscious mind. She sat up in her small apartment bedroom, pressing her palms against her temples where a familiar ache was building. The dreams had started the night after she'd begun working for the Donovans, and they were getting stronger, more detailed with each passing week. Rolling out of bed, she padded to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water, then found herself at the small desk by the window where she'd been sketching. Without fully realizing what she was doing, she picked up her pencil and began to draw. The boy from her dreams took shape on the paper. Angular features that would be handsome when he grew up. Eyes that seemed to hold secrets. A smile that was both mischievous and heartbreakingly sweet. She'd drawn him dozens of times now. Always from memory. Always with the same inexplicable certainty about details she couldn't possibly know. As dawn crept across the Charleston sky, Grace stared at her latest sketch and felt that familiar tug of recognition, like seeing a song title and having the melody right on the tip of her tongue but unable to quite grasp it. By 7 a.m., she was back at the Donovan mansion, letting herself in through the kitchen entrance as had become her routine. The house was quiet. Michael had already left for an early meeting, and the boys wouldn't be up for another hour. She used this time to prepare their breakfast and gather her thoughts. But this morning she found herself drawn to the family photographs that lined the hallway. She'd looked at them before, of course, but today something was different. She stopped in front of a portrait of Michael as a young boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, dressed in his Sunday best with a gap-toothed grin. Next to him stood a man who was clearly his father, and beside him, a woman Grace assumed was his mother. But it was the space next to young Michael that made her breath catch. The composition was slightly off. As if someone had been carefully cropped out of the image, she leaned closer, studying the way Michael's arm hung at an odd angle, the way his smile seemed directed at something, or someone, just outside the frame. "Grace." Jacob's sleepy voice startled her from her examination. He stood at the top of the stairs in his pajamas, his stuffed elephant tucked under one arm. "Why are you looking at the pictures?" "Just admiring your family," she said, forcing a smile. "Your dad was a handsome little boy." Jacob patted down the stairs and stood beside her, studying the same photograph. "Daddy says there used to be more pictures, but some got lost when Grandpa and Grandma moved to Florida." "Lost how?" Jacob shrugged with the casual indifference of childhood. "I don't know. He just gets sad sometimes when he looks at the old ones and says some things can't be replaced." Something cold settled in Grace's stomach. But before she could ask more questions, Caleb appeared, already dressed and ready for the day, with an efficiency that reminded her painfully of herself at that age. "Are we having pancakes again?" he asked hopefully. "If you want them," Grace replied, grateful for the distraction. "Though I was thinking we might try something different today. How do you feel about French toast?" "Can we help make it?" Jacob asked, bouncing on his toes. "I'd be disappointed if you didn't." In the kitchen, as she taught the boys how to whisk eggs and soak bread, Grace found herself watching their faces carefully. There was something about the way Caleb concentrated, his tongue poking out slightly as he focused, that sent another jolt of recognition through her, and Jacob's laugh when he got egg on his nose. "Grace, you okay?" Caleb asked, studying her with those too perceptive eyes. "You look kinda weird." "Just thinking," she said, but her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the cinnamon after breakfast, while the boys got ready for school. Grace found herself drawn back to the photographs. This time, she examined them more systematically, looking for patterns, for clues to the questions she couldn't even properly form. In Michael's study, she discovered more family pictures, some formal, some candid. Most featured the same people: Michael, his parents, various relatives. But in several of the older photos, that same odd composition appeared, suggesting missing elements that had been carefully edited out. Finding everything you need, Grace spun around, her heart hammering. Michael stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. The boys were asking about family pictures, and I thought I might find some to show them." It was a lie, and from the way Michael's eyes narrowed slightly, he knew it, but he didn't call her on it. "The boys mentioned you've been having trouble sleeping," he said instead, moving into the room. "Bad dreams." Grace stiffened. "They told you that." Jacob was worried. "He said he heard you talking in your sleep yesterday when you napped on the couch after lunch." Michael's voice was gentle, but there was something else there. Curiosity, maybe even concern. "He said you kept saying a name." "What name?" The question came out sharper than she'd intended. Michael studied her face carefully. He wasn't sure. Said it sounded like Mickey or Mikey. The blood drained from Grace's face. She'd never called anyone by those nicknames, had no memory of ever even hearing them. But something deep in her chest responded to the sound like a tuning fork struck just right. "Grace." Michael stepped closer, his brow furrowed with concern. "Are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine," she managed, but her voice sounded strange even to her own ears. "Just tired." "You're right about the sleep thing." She needed to get out of this room, away from those knowing eyes and the photographs that seemed to be hiding secrets she couldn't decode. But as she turned to leave, her gaze fell on one more picture, a candid shot of Michael as a teenager, maybe 15 or 16, standing in what looked like Forsyth Park in Savannah. He was holding an ice cream cone and laughing at something off camera, his whole face bright with joy. But it was the background that made Grace's knees go weak. The distinctive fountain, the same magnolia trees from her dreams, the exact spot where, in her recurring nightmares, she stood calling for someone who never answered. "That was taken the summer before senior year," Michael said, following her gaze. "Family vacation to Savannah. I loved that city. All that history, the squares, the way Spanish moss made everything look like something out of a fairy tale." Did you go there often?" Grace asked faintly. "A few times when I was younger. My parents had friends there." His voice grew quieter. "We stopped going after things changed." Grace wanted to ask what had changed, why they'd stopped visiting the city that appeared in her dreams with such vivid detail. But Jacob's voice from the front hall interrupted them. "Grace, we're gonna be late for school." "Coming," she called back, grateful for the escape, as she gathered the boys' backpacks and lunchboxes. Grace caught Michael watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. There were questions in his eyes, the same questions that were multiplying in her own mind with each passing day. At the school drop-off, Caleb hugged her goodbye, something he'd only started doing in the past few days, and whispered in her ear, "Grace, do you think people can remember things that happened before they can remember remembering them?" The question was so unexpectedly profound that Grace pulled back to look at him. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "Like, maybe when you were really little, things happened that your brain couldn't understand yet, but they're still in there somewhere, trying to get out." Grace's throat went dry. "Why do you ask?" Caleb shrugged, but his eyes were serious. "Sometimes I dream about Mom. but not from when I actually knew her. Like, from before, when I was too little to make real memories. But they feel real anyway. As Grace drove back to the mansion, Caleb's words echoed in her mind. Could it be possible that the dreams, the sketches, the inexplicable familiarity she felt with this family were fragments of something real? Something from a time too early for conscious memory, but still embedded somewhere in her subconscious. Back at the house, she found herself once again drawn to the photographs. But this time she was looking for something specific. If her dreams of Forsyth Park weren't just imagination, if her connection to this family ran deeper than coincidence, then maybe, just maybe, there would be some trace of evidence in a photo album tucked behind others on Michael's desk. She found what she was looking for and what she was most afraid to find. A picture of 2 children, maybe 4 or 5 years old, playing by the fountain in Forsyth Park. The boy was clearly Michael, younger than she'd ever seen him, his face bright with laughter, and beside him, holding his hand as they ran toward the camera, was a little girl with light brown hair and eyes that looked exactly like Grace's own. Her hands shaking, Grace pulled the photograph from its sleeve and turned it over. In faded blue ink, someone had written, "Mickey and Gracie, age 5, Forsyth Park, May 1997. The album slipped from her numb fingers and crashed to the floor. Photographs scattering across the Persian rug like pieces of a puzzle she'd been unknowingly trying to solve her entire life. Grace knelt on the Persian rug, surrounded by scattered photographs, her hands trembling as she held the picture that had turned her world upside down. The little girl's face staring back at her was unmistakably her own. The same eyes, the same stubborn chin, even the same way of tilting her head that she still did when concentrating. Mickey and Gracie, age 5, Forsyth Park, May 1997. The handwriting was feminine. Careful, probably Michael's mother. Grace flipped the photo again, studying the image of herself as a child she had no memory of being. The little girl was laughing, her small hand clasped tightly in the boy's, Mickey's, as they ran toward whoever was taking the picture. The sound of the front door opening sent panic shooting through her. Grace quickly gathered the scattered photographs, shoving them back into the album with shaking hands. She managed to get everything roughly back in place just as Michael's voice carried from the foyer. "Grace, I forgot some files. Everything okay?" "Fine," she called back, her voice higher than usual. "Just tidying up your study." She heard his footsteps on the marble floor, moving toward the stairs rather than the study, and sagged with relief. Carefully, she slipped the photograph of the 2 children into her purse, her heart pounding so hard she was sure Michael would hear it even from upstairs. When he came back down a few minutes later, she was in the kitchen, wiping already clean counters with unnecessary vigor. "You sure you're all right?" he asked, studying her flushed face. "You look like you've been running a marathon." "Just keeping busy," she managed. "How was your meeting?" Michael frowned, clearly not buying her casual tone, but before he could press further, his phone buzzed. "I have to take this," he said reluctantly. "Rain check on that conversation." Grace nodded quickly, grateful for the reprieve. As soon as he stepped into his study for privacy, she grabbed her purse and headed upstairs, ostensibly to check on the boys' rooms, but really to find somewhere to process what she'd discovered. In Caleb's room, she sat on the small chair by his desk and pulled out the photograph again. The longer she stared at it, the more certain she became that this wasn't some cosmic coincidence. The little girl in the picture was her, somehow. Impossibly, she had known Michael when they were children, but how and why couldn't she remember? She closed her eyes, trying to summon any fragment of memory from that time. The earliest thing she could recall with certainty was waking up in a white room at St. Anne's orphanage, maybe 6 years old, with Sister Margaret holding her hand and speaking in gentle, soothing tones about how she was safe now. Before that, nothing. Not her parents, not her home, not even her real name. The sisters had said she'd been found wandering in Forsyth Park. Confused and unable to tell them where she belonged, they'd called her Grace because it was the first word she'd been able to say clearly. But what if that wasn't the whole story? What if Grace hadn't been a random word, but a fragment of something larger? Gracie. Perhaps a nickname she'd been called by someone who loved her, lost in thought. She almost didn't hear the soft sound of something falling in Jacob's room next door. Moving quietly, She peered around the doorframe and saw that a small wooden box had tumbled from the top of his dresser, its contents spilling across the floor. Grace moved to clean up the mess, gathering scattered items. A few toy cars, some baseball cards, a rock painted to look like a ladybug. But as she reached for the last item, her breath caught in her throat. It was a photograph, yellowed with age and worn at the edges. The same photograph she'd just taken from Michael's study. With trembling fingers, she picked it up, comparing it to the one in her purse. They were identical. Same children, same park, same moment frozen in time. But this copy was more faded, as if it had been handled more frequently, loved more thoroughly. "That's my special picture." Grace spun around to find Jacob standing in the doorway, his school backpack still on his shoulders. "Jacob, I didn't hear you come in. Dad dropped us off early. He had another meeting." Jacob approached cautiously, eyeing the photograph in her hands. "You're not supposed to see that. It's secret." Grace's heart was racing again. Secret from who? From Dad. "Caleb found it in the attic last year when we were looking for Christmas decorations. We weren't supposed to be up there, but we heard Dad crying and wanted to help him find happy things." Jacob sat cross-legged on the floor, patting the space beside him for Grace to join him. She did, still clutching the photograph. "Caleb says the little girl looks like you," Jacob continued matter-of-factly. "That's why we kept it secret. We thought maybe if we kept it, you'd stay longer. Like maybe you were already part of our family somehow." Grace's throat constricted. "Jacob, where exactly did Caleb find this?" "In a box with lots of other pictures and some papers." Dad had written Gracie on the outside, but all the other stuff just said missing or lost. Jacob's voice dropped to a whisper. "Caleb thinks maybe Dad had a sister who got lost, and that's why he gets so sad sometimes." The room seemed to spin around Grace. She gripped the photograph tighter, her knuckles white. "Does Caleb know you took this picture?" Jacob nodded. "He said it was okay because Dad never looks in the box anyway. He said maybe the little girl was trying to come back to us, and this was her way of saying hello." Before Grace could respond, Caleb appeared in the doorway, taking in the scene with those perceptive eyes that missed nothing. "You found our secret," he said simply. Grace looked between the two boys. These children who had somehow sensed a connection she was only now beginning to understand. "Caleb, can you show me the box where you found this?" Caleb hesitated. "We're not supposed to go to the attic without Dad." "I know, but this is important, please." Something in her voice must have convinced him because after a long moment, he nodded. "Okay, but if we get in trouble, it was your idea." The attic was accessed through a pull-down ladder in the hall closet. Grace climbed up first, then helped both boys navigate the narrow space. The attic was dusty and filled with the detritus of family life. Old furniture, holiday decorations, boxes labeled with years and occasions. Caleb led them to a corner where several boxes sat stacked against the slanted wall. The one he pointed to was smaller than the others, and across its front, in Michael's careful handwriting, was indeed the name Gracie. With shaking hands, Grace lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of photographs, all featuring the same two children at various ages, playing in gardens, building sandcastles, sharing ice cream, sleeping curled together on a couch. There were also official-looking documents, newspaper clippings with headlines about missing children, and a small spiral notebook filled with what looked like Michael's handwriting. Grace picked up one of the documents, a missing person report dated June 15th, 1997. Her photograph stared back at her, 5 years old and smiling, under the heading, "Missing Gracie Elizabeth Donovan, age 5. Donovan. The name hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't just connected to this family. She was part of it. She was Michael's sister. "Grace," Jacob's small voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you okay? You look really pale." Grace couldn't speak. She fumbled through more documents, finding birth certificates, medical records, school enrollment forms, a paper trail of a life she'd lived and lost. According to the documents, she and Michael were twins, born just minutes apart on October 12th, 1991. A noise from downstairs made all three of them freeze. "Dad's home," Caleb whispered. "Boys, Grace." Michael's voice carried up from below. "Where is everyone?" Grace looked at the evidence scattered around her. 27 years of searching, of hoping, of mourning a sister he'd believed was lost forever. And here she was, having stumbled back into his life without either of them realizing the impossible truth. "We have to go down," she said quietly, her voice strange even to her own ears. "Are you going to tell Dad about the box?" Jacob asked, his eyes wide with worry. Grace looked at the photograph in her hands. Two children who had once been inseparable, who had somehow found each other again across decades and tragedy and impossible odds. "Yes," she said finally. "I think it's time your father knew that his sister came home." As they climbed down from the attic, Grace could hear Michael moving around in the kitchen, probably starting dinner preparations. In a few minutes, she would walk into that kitchen and turn both their worlds upside down with a truth so incredible it seemed like something out of a fairy tale. But first, she needed to call him by the name that had been trying to surface in her dreams for weeks. The name that had felt like coming home even when she couldn't remember why. "Mickey," she whispered to herself, testing the word. It felt right. It felt like family. It felt like finally remembering who she was supposed to be. Grace stood at the top of the staircase, the photograph clutched in her trembling hands while Caleb and Jacob flanked her like tiny sentinels. Below, she could hear Michael humming something under his breath in the kitchen, a tune that sent another jolt of recognition through her, though she couldn't place why. "Grace?" Caleb whispered. "You really think you're Dad's sister?" The question hung in the air like a held breath. Grace looked down at the faded image of two children who shared the same stubborn chin, the same way of tilting their heads when they smiled. "I think so, sweetheart. I think maybe I am." Jacob reached up and took her free hand, his small fingers warm against her cold skin. "That would make you our aunt." "Yes," Grace said softly. "It would." "Cool," Jacob said with 6-year-old pragmatism. "We always wanted an aunt." The simple acceptance in his voice nearly undid her. These children, who had lost so much, were ready to embrace her completely, without question or hesitation. It was the adults who would struggle with the impossibility of it all. Taking a deep breath, Grace descended the stairs, the boys close behind her. Each step felt monumental, as if she were walking toward a precipice from which there would be no return. By the time she reached the kitchen doorway, her heart was hammering so hard she was sure Michael would hear it. He stood at the stove, his back to them, stirring something that smelled like marinara sauce. He'd loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves, looking more relaxed than she'd seen him since she'd started working here. The domesticity of the scene. This man who had spent 3 years struggling to hold his family together, finally finding a moment of peace, made what she was about to do feel almost cruel. "Dad," Caleb said, his voice unusually formal. Michael turned, a smile already forming on his lips. "There you are. I was beginning to think you'd all been abducted by aliens." The smile faltered when he saw their faces. "Huh? What's wrong? You all look like someone died." Grace stepped forward, the photograph extended in her shaking hand. "Michael, we need to talk." He wiped his hands on a dish towel, his expression growing more concerned by the second. "Okay, boys, why don't you go?" "No," Grace interrupted. "They should hear this too. They're the ones who found it." Michael's eyes dropped to the photograph in her hand, and Grace watched the color drain from his face as recognition dawned. His lips moved soundlessly, and for a moment she thought he might collapse. "Where did you get this?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "From a box in the attic," Caleb said, stepping closer to Grace in a gesture of protection that broke her heart. "A box with your handwriting on it. A box labeled Gracie." Michael's legs seemed to give out. He sank into one of the kitchen chairs, his eyes never leaving the photograph. "That box was supposed to be sealed. I haven't looked at it in years because..." He trailed off, pressing his palms against his temples. Grace approached slowly, as if she were trying not to spook a wounded animal. "Michael, I need to ask you something, and I need you to really look at me when you answer." He raised his head, and she saw that his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "The little girl in this picture," Grace said carefully. "What happened to her?" "She disappeared." The words came out broken. "Fractured by years of grief. June 15th, 1997. We were at Forsyth Park with our parents. A family vacation to Savannah. Gracie and I were playing by the fountain while Mom and Dad sat on a bench nearby. There were so many people, and I turned away for just a second to chase a butterfly. And when I looked back," He stopped, his breathing ragged. She was gone, Grace finished softly. Michael nodded, unable to speak. Grace reached into her purse with her free hand and pulled out the identical photograph she'd taken from his study. I've been carrying this picture my entire life. The sisters at St. Anne's orphanage gave it to me when I was old enough to ask about my past. They said it was the only thing I had with me when they found me. Michael's eyes darted between the two photographs, his face a mask of confusion and dawning hope. That's impossible. Is it? Grace pulled out one of the documents from the attic box. The missing person report with her 5-year-old face smiling up from the page. Gracie Elizabeth Donovan, born October 12th, 1991, twin sister to Michael James Donovan. The silence that followed was so complete that Grace could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, the gentle bubbling of the sauce on the stove, the sound of her own heart breaking and healing simultaneously. But your name is Grace Miller, Michael said finally, his voice hollow with shock. Grace was the first word I could say clearly when they found me wandering in the park. The sisters thought it was a sign, so they named me after it. Miller was the name of my first foster family. She knelt beside his chair, bringing herself to his eye level. But my real name, the name I've been dreaming about for weeks without understanding why, is Gracie, and the little boy in my dreams who kept calling for me, who looked just like you. She reached out tentatively and touched his face. That was you, wasn't it? You were calling for me. Michael's composure finally cracked. A sob escaped his throat, and he pulled her into his arms so suddenly that she nearly lost her balance. For a moment, she stiffened. Physical affection had always been difficult for her, but then something deep inside her relaxed, recognizing this embrace in a way that bypassed conscious thought. I never stopped looking, he whispered against her hair. Even after the police said you were probably dead, even after Mom and Dad gave up hope, I never stopped believing you were out there somewhere. Grace felt tears streaming down her own face. I never stopped dreaming about you. For 27 years, I've had this recurring nightmare about a little boy calling my name in a park, and I could never reach him. I thought I was going crazy. They held each other for a long time, two pieces of a puzzle that had finally found their way back together. When they finally pulled apart, Grace saw that both boys were crying too, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming emotion of witnessing something miraculous. So you really are our aunt? Jacob asked, wiping his nose on his sleeve. Grace laughed through her tears. I really am. Does this mean you'll stay forever now? Caleb asked with the directness of childhood. Because you can't leave your family again? That would be against the rules. What rules? Michael asked, still holding Grace's hands as if he were afraid she might disappear again. The rules of families, Caleb said matter-of-factly. Once you find each other, you have to stick together. It's like a law or something. Grace looked at this little boy who had somehow understood what she was only beginning to grasp. That finding each other again wasn't just about solving a mystery or filling in blanks from the past. It was about choosing to be a family, about deciding that love was stronger than time or distance, or the cruelty of circumstances that had torn them apart. He's right, she said, squeezing Michael's hands. I can't leave my family again. I won't. But what about your life in Savannah? Your job, your apartment? Grace thought about her sparse one-bedroom apartment with its secondhand furniture and bare walls, about the temporary jobs she'd held, about the way she'd always felt like she was waiting for something without knowing what. I don't have a life there, Mickey. I have existence, this... She gestured to encompass him, the boys, the house that had felt like home from the moment she'd walked into it. This is life. Michael's eyes widened. You called me Mickey. Is that okay? It feels right. No one's called me that since. He smiled through his tears. Since you disappeared, Mom and Dad stopped using it after we lost you. Said it hurt too much. Grace, Jacob tugged on her sleeve. If you're our aunt, does that mean you can teach us about our mom? Since you're family now and everything, Grace looked at Michael, seeing the question in his eyes. How could she teach them about a woman she'd never met? But then she realized that maybe that wasn't what Jacob was really asking. I can teach you about family, she said carefully, about how love doesn't end just because someone isn't here anymore, and maybe your mom somehow knew that bringing us back together was exactly what you boys needed. You think Mom helped you find us? Caleb asked, his eyes wide. Grace thought about all the impossible coincidences that had led her here. Seeing the job listing, being hired despite her modest references, the instant connection she'd felt with the boys. "I think," she said slowly, "that mothers have a way of taking care of their families, even when we can't see them doing it." As if summoned by her words, the sauce on the stove began to bubble over. Filling the kitchen with the smell of tomatoes and herbs, Michael jumped up to tend to it, and Grace found herself automatically moving to help him, setting plates on the table while the boys gathered silverware. It was such a simple, domestic moment, a family preparing dinner together, but it felt like the most profound thing that had ever happened to her. For the first time in her life, she wasn't waiting for something to begin. She was finally, impossibly, home. 3 days had passed since the revelation that changed everything. Grace had barely left the Donovan mansion, sleeping in one of the guest rooms while she and Michael worked through 27 years of questions. Filling in the gaps of their separate lives, the boys had adapted to calling her Aunt Grace, with the remarkable resilience of children, as if they'd always known she belonged with them. Michael had taken time off from work, the first real break he'd allowed himself since Anna's death, and together they'd gone through the box from the attic methodically. Birth certificates, medical records, school photos. Grace had no memory of taking. Christmas morning snapshots where she and Michael sat surrounded by identical wrapping paper, wearing matching pajamas their mother had obviously coordinated. "I can't believe Mom kept all this," Grace murmured. Holding a report card from kindergarten, her teacher had written, "Gracie is a delightful child, though she tends to become anxious when separated from her brother Michael for too long. She never gave up hope," Michael said quietly. "Dad wanted to pack it all away after the first year, said it was too painful, but Mom refused. She said when you came home, you'd want to know about the life you'd missed." Grace's throat tightened. Do you think they would have liked who I became?" Michael looked up from the school photo he'd been studying, both of them gap-toothed and grinning at 7 years old. "Grace, are you kidding? You took 2 traumatized little boys who'd terrorized 17 nannies and turned them back into children? You brought laughter back into this house? You brought me back to life? They would have been so proud of the woman you are." That afternoon, while Michael took the boys to their first therapy session with Dr. Patricia Chen, a family counselor who specialized in helping children process major life changes, Grace found herself alone in the mansion for the first time since the truth had come out. She wandered through rooms that felt different now, not because they'd changed, but because she had. The family portraits no longer showed strangers. They showed her history, her people, her home. In Anna's room, which Michael had left largely untouched since her death, Grace stood before the vanity table, looking at the personal items Anna had left behind: perfume bottles, jewelry, a hairbrush that still held strands of dark hair. On the nightstand sat a framed photo of Anna with the twins as babies, her face glowing with the joy of new motherhood. "I wish I could have met you," Grace whispered to the photograph. "I wish I could have been here to help." As she turned to leave, something caught her eye. Behind the nightstand, wedged between the wall and the furniture, was the corner of what looked like a leather journal. Grace hesitated. She'd already intruded enough on this family's private spaces, but curiosity won out. She carefully maneuvered the journal free and found herself holding what was clearly Anna's personal diary. The leather was soft and worn, the pages filled with Anna's neat handwriting. Grace knew she should put it back, should respect the privacy of a woman who couldn't consent to having her private thoughts read. But the journal had fallen open to an entry dated just weeks before Anna's death, and the first line made Grace's breath catch. "I finally found her. After months of searching, Detective Hayes located Michael's sister." With shaking hands, Grace sank onto the edge of Anna's bed and began to read. March 15th, 2019. "I can't sleep. Detective Hayes called today with news that seems too good to be true. He's found Grace, Michael's twin sister who disappeared when they were 5. She's been living in Savannah all these years, working as a nanny, never knowing she had a family looking for her. I hired Hayes 6 months ago, against Michael's wishes. He said I was wasting money on false hope, that we needed to focus on our own family instead of chasing ghosts. But I couldn't let it go. I've watched my husband carry the weight of losing his sister for our entire marriage. He blames himself, even though he was just a child. The guilt has shaped every relationship he's ever had, including ours. He loves me. I know he does. But there's a part of his heart that's been frozen since that day in Forsyth Park. A part that's never stopped searching, never stopped hoping, never stopped grieving. I thought if I could bring his sister home, I could heal that broken piece of him. Grace's hands trembled as she turned the page. March 22nd, 2019. Hayes sent photos. Oh my God. She looks exactly like Michael. Same eyes, same stubborn jawline, same way of holding herself like she's ready to protect everyone around her. Her name is Grace Miller now. She works for families in Savannah, taking care of children who aren't her own, because she doesn't know she has nephews who need their aunt. I want to tell Michael, but Hayes advised against it until we know more. What if she doesn't want to be found? What if the life she's built is enough for her? What if bringing her back opens old wounds that are better left alone? But I keep thinking about Caleb and Jacob, how they've been asking about extended family, about why we don't have grandparents or aunts and uncles like their friends do. They deserve to know their history. They deserve to have more family than just Michael and me. The entries continued, chronicling Anna's careful research into Grace's life, her growing certainty that reuniting the twins was the right thing to do, her plans to approach the situation delicately. April 2nd, 2019. I've made the decision. I'm going to Savannah next week to meet with Sister Margaret at St. Anne's Orphanage. Hayes thinks she might be willing to help facilitate contact. She's known Grace since she was a child, and would be able to advise us on the best approach. I haven't told Michael yet. I want to surprise him for our anniversary next month. 9 years of marriage. And I want to give him the one thing he's always wanted but never dared to hope for. His sister back. Grace's vision blurred with tears as she read the final entry. April 8th, 2019. Tomorrow is the day. I'm driving to Savannah to meet with Sister Margaret and hopefully get a chance to see Grace from a distance, just to make sure she seems happy and settled before we turn her world upside down. Hayes found out she works at a daycare center on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I might try to catch a glimpse of her there. Michael thinks I'm going shopping with Jennifer for anniversary dinner supplies. He has no idea I'm about to give him the best present of his life. I can't wait to see his face when I tell him his Gracie is coming home. I keep thinking about something Caleb said yesterday when we were looking at old photo albums. He pointed to a picture of Michael as a child and asked why Daddy always looked sad in the old pictures. Even when he was smiling, it's like he's looking for something that isn't there. Caleb said, "Soon, sweetheart. Soon Daddy won't have to look anymore." The diary slipped from Grace's numb fingers and fell to the floor. April 9th, 2019, the day Anna had died in a car accident on Highway 17. Just outside Savannah, she had been coming home from trying to reunite Michael with his lost sister. Anna had died because of her, because of a generous impulse to heal her husband's oldest wound. Anna had gotten behind the wheel of a car and driven toward a reunion that would never happen. Until now, 3 years too late, when the woman she'd died trying to find had stumbled into their lives through pure chance. Or perhaps it wasn't chance at all. Grace picked up the diary with shaking hands and flipped to the very last page, where Anna had written in different ink, as if she'd returned to add one final thought. P.S. If something happens to me before I can make this reunion happen, I hope somehow, some way, Grace will find her way to Michael and the boys anyway. I believe love is stronger than death, stronger than time, stronger than all the circumstances that keep families apart. I believe in miracles, and I believe Michael and Grace are each other's miracle. Take care of my boys, Grace. Love them the way only family can. And please, please tell Michael that losing you wasn't his fault. It never was. Grace pressed the diary to her chest and sobbed. For Anna, who had died trying to heal a family she'd never even met. For Michael, who had spent 3 years not knowing that his wife's death was connected to his sister's disappearance. For all the time they'd lost, all the conversations that would never happen, all the ways Anna's generosity had shaped a destiny she'd never lived to see fulfilled. When Michael and the boys returned an hour later, they found Grace in the kitchen, making dinner with red-rimmed eyes and a determined expression. "Everything okay?" Michael asked, studying her face. Grace looked at him. This brother who had searched for her for 27 years. This man who had no idea that his wife had died trying to bring his sister home, and made a decision that would change everything once again. "We need to talk," she said quietly. "There's something else you need to know." Grace set Anna's diary on the kitchen table between her and Michael. like a bridge across an impossible chasm. The boys were upstairs getting ready for bed, their voices carrying faintly through the ceiling as they argued over whose turn it was to brush teeth first. A wonderfully normal sound that made what Grace was about to reveal feel even more surreal. Anna kept a diary, she said simply. Michael's face went pale. He'd been reaching for his coffee cup, but his hand stopped midway. Grace, I don't think... She was trying to find me, Michael. Before she died, she hired a private detective to locate your sister. Grace pushed the diary toward him. She died driving to Savannah to arrange our reunion. The silence that followed was so complete it felt suffocating. Michael stared at the leather journal as if it were a loaded gun, his green eyes wide with something between hope and terror. That's impossible, he whispered. Read it. With trembling hands, Michael opened to the first entry Grace had marked. She watched his face as he read, saw the exact moment when Anna's words hit him like a physical blow. His breathing became shallow, erratic, and twice he had to stop and press his palms against his eyes. When he finished, he looked up at Grace with an expression of such raw anguish that she nearly reached across the table to comfort him. But she sensed he needed space to process this revelation, needed to feel the full weight of it before he could move forward. She died because of me, he said finally, his voice broken. Anna died because she was trying to fix something I couldn't let go of. No, Grace's voice was firm. Anna died because she loved you enough to want to heal an old wound. That's not the same thing. If I hadn't been so obsessed with finding you... Michael, stop. Grace leaned forward, her eyes intense. Anna chose to hire that detective. Anna chose to drive to Savannah. Anna chose to try to reunite us because she saw how much pain you carried and wanted to help. Blaming yourself for her generosity dishonors the love behind it. Michael buried his face in his hands. But if she hadn't died, you would have found us 3 years ago. The boys would have grown up knowing their aunt. You wouldn't have spent all that time alone. And you wouldn't have needed a nanny, Grace said quietly. I wouldn't have seen your job listing. We might never have found each other at all. She reached across the table and touched his wrist. Maybe Anna's death wasn't the end of her plan. Maybe it was just a detour. They sat in silence for a long moment, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Michael looked up. The detective, Robert Hayes. Is his number in there? Grace nodded, flipping to a page where Anna had written Hayes' contact information in neat block letters. We should call him. Now. Why wait? We've already waited 27 years. Michael studied her face, seeing something there he hadn't noticed before. A strength that had been forged in loss and solitude, a determination that matched his own. Okay, let's call him, Hayes answered on the third ring, his voice gravelly with age and too many cigarettes. Hayes Investigations. Mr. Hayes, this is Michael Donovan. I believe you were working with my wife Anna before she passed away. A long pause. Jesus, Michael, is that really you? Yes, sir. I'm calling because we found her. We found Gracie. The silence on the other end stretched so long that Michael wondered if they'd been disconnected. When Hayes finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. How? When? Is she okay? She's here with me now. It's a long story, but she answered a job posting to be a nanny for my sons. We just figured out who she was 3 days ago. Son of a bitch, Hayes breathed. Anna always said she believed in miracles. But this is something else entirely. Mr. Hayes, Grace interjected, leaning toward the phone. This is Grace. Gracie, I was wondering if you could tell us what happened that day. The day Anna died. Another pause. You sure you want to know? It's not going to be easy to hear. Grace and Michael looked at each other. A silent conversation passing between them. Finally, Michael nodded. We need to know. Hayes sighed deeply. Anna came to my office that morning, April 9th. She was nervous but excited. Said she'd been planning this surprise for weeks. I tried to talk her out of going alone. Suggested we arrange a more formal introduction, but she was determined to scope things out first. Said she wanted to make sure you were happy where you were before we disrupted your life. Grace's throat tightened, even in trying to reunite them. Anna had been thinking of Grace's well-being first. She drove down to St. Anne's orphanage to meet with Sister Margaret. Hayes continued. The nun remembered you well, said you'd been one of their success stories. Intelligent, kind, good with children, but always seemed like you were searching for something. They arranged for Anna to observe you at the daycare where you volunteered on weekends. I remember that day, Grace said softly. April 9th. I was reading to the toddlers, and I kept feeling like someone was watching me. I turned around a few times, but Anna was there, Hayes confirmed. She spent about an hour watching you interact with the kids, and according to Sister Margaret, she was crying by the end of it. Said you looked exactly like Michael did when he worked with children. Patient, gentle, like you understood their pain because you'd been there yourself. Michael reached over and squeezed Grace's hand, both of them imagining Anna watching from a distance, seeing the sister-in-law she'd never get to meet, but somehow already loved. She was supposed to meet with Sister Margaret again that afternoon to discuss the best way to approach you, Hayes continued, his voice growing heavier, but she never made it. The accident happened on Highway 17, about 20 miles outside Savannah. Witnesses said a semi ran a red light. Anna didn't have a chance. Grace closed her eyes, picturing Anna driving back toward Charleston, probably planning exactly how she'd tell Michael about the miracle she'd arranged, the sister who was finally coming home. Mr. Hayes, Michael said carefully, why didn't you contact me after Anna died? You knew where Gracie was. The detective was quiet for so long that Grace wondered if he was still there. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Because I felt responsible. If I hadn't taken Anna's money, if I hadn't encouraged her to believe she could fix everything, she'd still be alive. I couldn't bear to face you with the news that your sister was alive when finding her had cost you your wife. So what did you do? Grace asked gently. I kept tabs on you from a distance, made sure you were okay, that you had work, that nobody was bothering you, and I kept meaning to work up the courage to tell Michael, but how do you make that phone call? How do you say, your wife died trying to give you this gift, and now I'm finally delivering it? Grace felt tears streaming down her face. You've been watching over me for 3 years. Best I could. I'm the one who made sure that newspaper with Michael's Nanny ad ended up on your doorstep. Figured if Anna believed in miracles, maybe I should try trusting in one myself. Michael's eyes went wide. You made sure she saw the ad. Left it there 3 mornings in a row until she finally picked it up. Wasn't sure she'd respond. But Anna always said love finds a way. Guess she was right. Grace looked at Michael, seeing the same awe and gratitude in his expression that she felt. All those coincidences that had brought her here, the job listing, the immediate connection with the boys, the way everything had fallen into place, hadn't been coincidences at all. They'd been the final act of Anna's love, executed by a broken detective who'd spent 3 years trying to honor a promise made to a woman who'd died believing in miracles. Mr. Hayes, Grace said softly, would you like to meet them? Anna's boys. I think they'd like to hear about how their mother was trying to bring their aunt home. Are you sure? After everything you kept me safe. Grace interrupted. You made sure I found my way back to my family. Anna would be grateful, and so are we. When they hung up 20 minutes later, after making plans for Hayes to visit the following weekend, Michael and Grace sat in the quiet kitchen, processing everything they'd learned. She really did it, Michael said finally. Anna brought you home. Grace nodded, thinking about Anna's final diary entry, about love being stronger than death and time and circumstances. She just did it from a place we couldn't see. Upstairs, they could hear the boys getting ready for bed. Jacob's voice raised in protest about something while Caleb tried to mediate with Big Brother authority. It was the sound of a family settling into evening routines, of children secure enough in their world to argue about small things. Grace, Michael said quietly, I need you to know something. Anna would have loved you so much, and if she were here now, seeing how you've helped heal our boys, how you've brought light back into this house, she'd be so proud of what she made possible. Grace wiped her eyes, thinking about a woman she'd never met, but who had shaped her destiny through pure, selfless love. I hope I can be worthy of her sacrifice. You already are, Michael said simply. You came home. That's all she ever wanted. 6 weeks after the revelation that changed everything, Grace stood in the master bedroom she'd claimed as her own, Anna's former craft room that Michael had insisted she renovate however she wanted. Sunlight streamed through the windows she'd uncovered, illuminating walls now painted a warm cream instead of the stark white that had made the space feel more like a hospital room than a home. She was packing the last of her belongings from her Savannah apartment, a process that had taken all of 30 minutes, 27 years of life, and everything she truly valued fit into 2 small boxes, a few photographs from St. Anne's, some books, and the wooden memory box Eleanor had given her all those years ago. "That's it?" Michael asked from the doorway, eyeing the meager collection with something that looked like heartbreak. "That's it." Grace folded the final sweater, one of only 3 she owned, and placed it in the box. Turns out, when you spend your whole life waiting for something to begin, you don't accumulate much along the way. Michael entered the room and sat on the edge of what was now Grace's bed, running his hands through his hair in a gesture she'd come to recognize as his way of processing difficult emotions. "I hate that you lived like that. Like you were just existing until something better came along." "But something better did come along," Grace said gently, settling beside him. "I came home." The transformation in all of them over the past month and a half had been remarkable. The boys had flourished with the security of knowing their family was complete. Their grades had improved. Their nightmares had virtually disappeared, and they'd started talking about their mother with joy, instead of desperate grief. Caleb had even begun building those elaborate Lego cities again, though now he always made sure to include a special house for Aunt Grace. Michael had changed too. The lines of constant worry had eased from his face, and for the first time since Anna's death, he'd started making plans beyond just surviving each day. The Donovan group was not only stable again, but expanding, and Michael had begun talking about taking the boys on a real vacation, maybe back to Savannah, to show Grace the places where they'd played as children. "The lawyer called this morning," Michael said, pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket. "The paperwork is all finalized." Grace took the documents with trembling hands. Her legal name change was official: Grace Elizabeth Donovan. After 27 years of being Grace Miller, she was finally, legally, herself again. "How does it feel?" Michael asked, watching her face. "Like I can breathe properly for the first time in my life." Grace traced her finger over the signature line where she'd signed her real name for the first time in decades. "Like I finally know who I'm supposed to be." A crash from downstairs, followed by Jacob's voice calling, "We're okay," made them both laugh. "I should go check on that," Michael said, but he made no move to leave. Instead, he pulled out another envelope, this one more worn. "I have something else for you." Grace recognized Anna's handwriting on the outside. "For Gracie, when she comes home." "Anna wrote this?" Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I found it in her jewelry box yesterday when I was finally ready to go through her things. She must have written it after she hired Detective Hayes. But before," he trailed off, still unable to say the words out loud. With shaking hands, Grace opened the envelope and unfolded a single sheet of Anna's careful script. "Dear Gracie, if you're reading this, it means my plan worked, and you found your way back to Michael and the boys. I can't tell you how happy that makes me, even though I'll probably never get to meet you in person. I want you to know that bringing you home isn't just my gift to Michael. It's my gift to Caleb and Jacob too. They need their aunt more than they realize. They need someone who understands what it's like to lose family too young. Someone who can teach them that love doesn't end when people go away. Michael talks about you sometimes, usually late at night when he thinks I'm sleeping. He still blames himself for losing you, still carries that guilt like a stone in his chest. Please help him understand that some things happen that are nobody's fault, that love isn't always strong enough to prevent loss, but it's always strong enough to heal from it. Take care of my boys, Gracie. Love them the way only family can. Show them that home isn't a place. It's the people who know your whole story and choose to stay anyway. And please, please don't blame yourself for what happened to me. If I died bringing you home, then I died doing something worthwhile. That's not a tragedy. That's grace. Welcome home, sister. Love, Anna." Grace pressed the letter to her chest, tears streaming down her face. Even in death, Anna was still taking care of them, still finding ways to heal the wounds that time and circumstance had left behind. "She called me sister," Grace whispered. Michael's own eyes were bright with tears. "She would have loved you so much. I think she did love me, before we ever met. She loved me because I was part of you." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts about the woman who had orchestrated their reunion from beyond the grave. Finally, Grace folded the letter carefully and placed it in her memory box alongside Eleanor's stone and the faded photograph of 2 children playing in Forsyth Park. "Grace," Michael said suddenly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest." She turned to face him, seeing an uncertainty in his expression that worried her. "What is it? Are you happy here? Really? Truly happy? Or are you staying because you feel obligated to? Because we're family and family is supposed to stick together?" The question caught Grace off guard. "Why would you ask that?" "Because I watch you sometimes, and you still have this look in your eyes, like you're waiting for permission to really settle in, like you're afraid this is all too good to be true." Michael's voice was gentle but concerned. "I don't want you to stay just because you think it's what Anna would have wanted, or because the boys need you. I want you to stay because this feels like home to you too." Grace was quiet for a long moment, considering how to put into words something she'd barely admitted to herself. "Do you remember what it felt like, being 5 years old and losing me? Every detail. I need you to understand that I've felt that way every single day for 27 years. Not just sad or lonely, but incomplete, like a part of me was missing, and I didn't even know what it was." She took his hands in hers. "Being here, with you and the boys, is the first time I've felt whole since I was 5 years old. This isn't obligation. Mickey, this is coming back to life." Michael's smile was radiant. "Good, because I have a confession too." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where Grace could see Caleb and Jacob building some kind of fort out of old sheets and garden stakes. "I haven't just been happy these past weeks. I've been myself, the person I was before I lost you, before I learned to live with that constant ache of something missing. You didn't just come home, Gracie. You brought me home too." A particularly loud crash from the backyard made them both laugh, breaking the emotional intensity of the moment. "I should definitely check on that," Michael said, heading for the door. "Detective Hayes will be here in an hour, and I'd rather not have to explain why our lawn looks like a disaster zone." Grace nodded, but as he reached the doorway, she called after him. "Mickey." He turned back. "Thank you for never giving up. Thank you for carrying me in your heart all those years, even when everyone else said to let go. Thank you for finding your way back to us," he replied simply, "even when you didn't know you were looking." After he left, Grace sat alone in her new room, surrounded by evidence of a life finally being lived instead of merely endured. Through the window, she could see her nephews playing in the garden, their laughter carrying on the warm afternoon air. Downstairs, she could hear Michael moving around the kitchen, probably starting preparations for dinner with Detective Hayes. For the first time in her adult life, Grace Donovan, not Miller, but Donovan, was exactly where she belonged. She was home. She was family, and she was no longer waiting for her life to begin. It already had. 6 months later, Grace stood in the garden of the Donovan mansion, watching the final preparations for what Caleb had dubbed the most important party in the history of everything. White ribbons fluttered from the ancient oak trees, and strings of warm lights created a canopy of stars. Even though it was only 3 o'clock in the afternoon, today was the day they would officially celebrate what had taken months to arrange legally. Grace's recognition as a full heir to the Donovan family legacy, her adoption of the boys as her legal nephews, and what Michael had quietly called the completion of our circle. Aunt Grace. Jacob came running across the lawn, his good shoes already grass-stained, and his carefully combed hair standing at impossible angles. "Detective Hayes is here, and he brought presents." Grace smoothed down his cowlick with practiced ease. "Did you remember to say thank you?" "Yes, but he said we should wait to open them until everyone's here because they're significant, whatever that means." Through the French doors, Grace could see Detective Hayes in the living room, looking uncomfortable in his best suit, but smiling as Michael poured him a glass of wine. The past 6 months had transformed the gruff detective into an unofficial grandfather figure for the boys, and Grace suspected his significant gifts would be memorably sentimental. "Grace," Caleb appeared at her elbow with his characteristic quiet intensity. "Are you nervous?" "A little," she admitted, straightening his tie. "Are you?" "No, today's not about being nervous. Today's about being officially official." He paused, studying her face with those perceptive eyes that missed nothing. "You know you were already our family before all the paperwork, right?" Grace's throat tightened with emotion. "I know, sweetheart. But sometimes it's nice to make things official so the whole world knows." Sister Margaret arrived shortly after, her familiar habit exchanged for a simple blue dress that made her look younger and somehow less intimidating than Grace remembered, at 73. The nun, who had been Grace's surrogate mother for most of her childhood, moved with careful dignity, but her eyes were bright with tears as she embraced her former charge. "Look at you," Sister Margaret whispered, holding Grace at arm's length. "Look at this life you've built. When I saw that little girl lost in the park all those years ago, I prayed she'd find her way home someday. I never imagined it would be this beautiful." The ceremony itself was simple. Judge Patricia Martinez, a family friend, presiding over the legal formalities in the garden where Grace had first felt the pull of belonging. Michael had written a speech, but when the moment came, he set his notes aside and spoke from the heart. "6 months ago, I thought I knew what family meant," he began, his voice carrying easily across the small gathering of friends and colleagues. "I thought it was about blood and genes and shared history. What I've learned is that family is about choice. It's about people who see you at your worst and decide to stay anyway. It's about love that's stronger than time or distance, or the cruelest tricks of fate." He looked directly at Grace, his eyes bright with tears he no longer tried to hide. "Grace Elizabeth Donovan was always my sister, even when we didn't know where to find each other. But today, she's choosing to be my sister, to be Caleb and Jacob's aunt, to be part of this family not because genetics demand it, but because love demands it." When it came time for Grace to speak, she pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket. Not a prepared speech, but Anna's letter, worn soft from being read and reread. "I can't talk about family today without acknowledging the person who made this reunion possible," she said, her voice steady despite the tears. "Anna Donovan died trying to bring me home to you. She never got to meet me, never got to see Caleb and Jacob discover they had an aunt, never got to witness the miracle she set in motion." Grace looked up at the sky, where clouds were beginning to gather for an afternoon shower. "But I feel her here today, in the way these boys love without reservation, in the way Michael has opened his heart and his home, in the way this family has made space for someone who was lost for so very long." She folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into her pocket. Anna wrote that home isn't a place. It's the people who know your whole story and choose to stay anyway. "Thank you for staying. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for making me part of your story." After the ceremony, as guests mingled and the boys showed off their newfound ability to carry on adult conversations without causing mayhem, Detective Hayes approached Grace with a wrapped box. "This is from Anna," he said simply. Grace's hands trembled as she unwrapped what appeared to be a jewelry box. Inside, nestled in white silk, was a locket on a delicate gold chain. When she opened it, her breath caught. On one side was a miniature version of the photograph of 5-year-old Mickey and Gracie playing in Forsyth Park. On the other side, Anna had somehow managed to fit a picture of Caleb and Jacob as babies, their faces peaceful in sleep. "She had this made right after she hired me," Hayes explained quietly. "Said if she was bringing Michael's sister home, she wanted to give her something that connected past and present, something that showed how love creates family across generations." Grace clasped the locket around her neck, feeling the weight of it settle against her heart like a benediction. As evening fell and the last guests departed, the 4 of them, Michael, Grace, Caleb, and Jacob, found themselves alone in the garden where it had all begun. The boys were sprawled on a blanket, pointing out constellations in the darkening sky, their voices soft with contentment. "That's Orion," Jacob said confidently, having become something of an astronomy expert under Grace's tutelage. "And that's the Big Dipper," Caleb added, "which points to the North Star." "What's the North Star for?" Jacob asked. "It helps people find their way home when they're lost," Grace said, settling on the blanket beside them. "Like how you found your way home to us?" Jacob asked with 6-year-old directness. Grace looked up at the stars, thinking about all the years she'd gazed at them from orphanage windows and lonely apartments, never knowing they were the same stars her brother was watching from this very garden. "Exactly like that." Michael joined them on the blanket, completing their circle. "Do you think Mom can see the stars from heaven?" Caleb asked suddenly. "I think your mom can see everything," Grace said gently. "I think she's watching right now, happy that her family is together. All of us." Jacob pressed. All of us. Later, after the boys had been tucked into bed with extra hugs and promises that everything would be exactly the same in the morning, except now it was official. Grace and Michael sat on the front porch, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the last of the evening light fade from the sky. "Any regrets?" Michael asked quietly. Grace thought about the question seriously, considering the life she'd left behind in Savannah, the small apartment, the temporary jobs, the careful distance she'd maintained from everyone she met. "Only one," she said finally. Michael tensed beside her. "I regret that Anna never got to meet me in person. I would have liked to thank her for seeing what we couldn't see ourselves, that some kinds of love are strong enough to survive anything, even death." Michael's hand found hers in the darkness. "She knows somehow. Wherever she is, she knows." A year later, Grace would visit Anna's grave for the first time, bringing flowers and a photo of Caleb and Jacob's first day of second grade. She would kneel beside the headstone and whisper, "Thank you for bringing me home, sister. Thank you for loving a family you'd never met enough to die trying to heal them." But tonight, surrounded by the sounds of a house settling into peaceful sleep, Grace Donovan was exactly where she belonged. She was home, she was family, and she was finally, completely, whole. The grandfather clock in the foyer chimed 10 times, its deep resonance no longer sounding like a funeral bell, but like a celebration, marking not time lost, but time finally, perfectly found. In the garden, the North Star shone bright and steady, guiding all lost souls home.